Titilola Louisa Natasha Anidugbe. The name is very, I always find it very sophisticated, the name. And maybe some of you are watching who have worked with her in Airtel Nigeria. I wanted to just say hello and hi to her. She's here today and she's going to be talking to us not about IT, not about service management, but about her book, which is coming within the year, Emancipados of Lagos. I hope I got that right. That is from Portuguese, Emancipados of Lagos. So Titi, please say hello.
Welcome everybody, and thank you, Kenneth, for the introduction. I've had a very interesting career, as you clearly outlined. But yes, I'm right now completing my work on my ancestors, which really started in 1994 with the help of my father and my sister. We, I mean, the name Marino, it just begged for further investigation. So hence we started looking. And since then, I have been able to put together quite a bit of information on what happened and how that came to be. Thank you.
Awesome. Amazing. Thank you very much, Titi. Thank you very much. Thank you so much. I got very much interested in the book because of the fact that it speaks to the history of us as a people. What sparked your interest in writing about the history of your ancestors in the context of slavery? And is this something that we should be passing on to our children?
Okay. My interest was basically sparked from the moment I started school. When you go to school and everybody else's name is Adewumi, Adeleke, Adeni, and your name is Marino, you go home and you ask some questions, and that really was the start for me. However, at some point, once I come back from school abroad, I actually sat with my father and my sister, as I said earlier, and we started asking some questions, some very basic questions. Why do we have a Portuguese name? Where did our ancestor come from? Who was he? What was his name? And we found that nobody really knew the answers. And so that sparked my father's interest. And really, without him, I wouldn't have gotten as far as I've gotten in terms of documenting everything. Because my father then went out and bought every history book that had ever been printed, and made inquiries within the family to find some of the answers to some of our very basic questions. But to put it simply, in the last 3-4 years, I picked up where he left off. He's now late, and in that time, I've been able to find out the name of my ancestor. He came from Oyo. He was taken to Brazil. He worked in Brazil. He was a slave of a very, very wealthy slave trader, and he adopted the man's name. So whilst his first name was Geronimo, his master's name was Joaquim Pereira Marino. And so he became Geronimo Joaquim Pereira Marino. And, I found documents in Brazil, documents in Wida, because when he came back, he didn't actually come to Lagos. He actually settled in Wida, where a lot of former Oyo slaves settled. So he settled in a community. And it is his second son who picked up and came to Lagos. And all the Marinos in my own family are the product of his second son. There are other Marinos in Lagos, and coincidentally, I have also found original documents from Brazil that indicate that their ancestor was also a slave of the same man, Joaquim Pereira Marino, and so consequently, the two families know themselves very well. And on Lagos Island, there is a community which development has sort of, I don't know, affected.
Mm.
I won't say badly, but it has made the community a little different. When I was growing up, that community was very close, still very close. And somewhere in the 80s and 90s, with the development of Lagos Island, the community got dispersed. And so I talk a lot about what has happened as a consequence of our ancestors coming back, settling,
Okay.
developing, and then, moving out of the island. And so that's really what the book is about. And so, as a consequence, it's not just my ancestor that's covered in the book, because, of
Mm.
course, his children married other returnees. They
Yeah.
were all called returnees. Some of them
Mhm.
came back from Brazil, some of them, like my ancestor, but some of them also came back from Sierra Leone, because ships going to the Americas that were captured by the British were taken to Sierra Leone and offloaded. All the slaves were offloaded there, and they started families there. And first and second generation in Sierra Leone also came back to Lagos Island. And there was a mix. By the time a generation had passed, they were marrying each other,
Mhm.
and literally formed this larger community with the Aworis, who are the indigenous Lagosians. And
Okay.
so
Wow.
the story is quite vast in what it goes into.
Okay. Well, that's awesome. So, in essence, the identity of these original Yorubas was merged with a Portuguese identity. So
Yes,
the slaves were now answering the names of the slave owners, so much so you had to do an investigation to
yes,
discover how that happened.
yes.
That's
And
amazing.
Yorubas were not the only ones. I mean, I
Yes.
have relations from Bida. I found relations who were Hausa,
Hmm.
and so on. So yeah, it was quite a blend that happened and
Okay.
ended up in Brazil.
Wow. So how did it make you feel discovering this part of your history, so to speak?
History, I feel, has many things that it gives you as an individual. It gave me a sense of identity, sense of self
Hmm.
worth. It enabled me to see the value systems, both the Yoruba unadulterated value system as well as the adopted value systems of my ancestors.
Hmm.
They came back and they were, literally the first Christians on the west coast of Africa, because they came back as Catholics,
Hmm.
and they were very staunch religious people. Some of them were Catholic, some of them were Muslim, some of them
Okay.
worshipped Ifa and continued to do so irrespective of being Christian or Muslim. They actually
Mm.
continued with their traditional beliefs. And
Okay.
the book goes into detail about who was doing what and how they were
How
doing it.
do these things impact the way we relate with each other today? Do you think the knowledge of our history of slavery impacts our self-esteem? Are we still operating, for example, as slaves when we work outside Africa or when we work for foreigners, even in our own country? What do you think about that?
Just from a historical perspective, I deal with history from about the 1650s all the way through to 1650s to the early 19th, 20th century, rather. And war impacted slavery very definitely. All the slaves carted out of Africa were almost from about the 17th century, 18th century, and 19th century, all based on wars.
Mhm.
If I wage war against you and I win, I get to plunder your entire population and put them on ships and ship them off to wherever in the Americas. And that really, it spurred whole nations or ethnic groups to wage war consistently. So that's the background, or that's the view I have of war based on my own research.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the Oyo Empire was a little different. That had disintegrated from within, and because the politics within the empire had made it weak, its civil defenses became weak, and so when it was attacked from Usman Danfodio and from Dahomey, it was already very weak and so susceptible. So the people that we call slaves were actually normal, everyday citizens. They were not slaves here in Africa necessarily, not all of them.
Mm, mm,
And they some of them were just picked up because maybe I'm on a bandwagon, a trading mission, and we are cornered by highway robbers, and I become a slave.
mm.
Or I could have just gone fishing and been caught on my own and become a slave. So not everybody had the same experience, but generally speaking, that's how most of them became slaves.
Wow.
I refer to slavery as a label and not really as a condition. It is a label. Um, in terms of how we see ourselves, I would say it definitely still affects us. I did not meet one person in my community, that would be the returnee Brazilian community, that was happy or even willing to discuss an ancestor that was a slave.
Mm,
The impact of that is the history is then not told because we are already ashamed. We're already on the defensive.
mm,
And these are some sad facts because when you probe even a little bit more, you find that these people were extraordinary. They were really very visionary. They came back having picked up a lot from where they had been and contributed immensely to the development of what we now call Nigeria. Um, the first place to be colonized in Nigeria was Lagos, and that was where they all lived. And they are the ones who came back with the skill sets to do buildings in concrete, to build roads, to put street lights in. They understood what hospitals were like. They were coming from environments where those things already existed, and they brought the skills to build and develop those things back with them. And so when we look at Lagos and we say, oh, it's very progressive compared to the rest of Nigeria, these are the people who started that road on that progression. So I think we should be proud of our history. I really do.
mm.
But overcoming the stigma of having an ancestor who was called a slave is still very traumatic. And I think it has to do a lot with the fact that as black people, we still suffer from racism, we still suffer from various injustices and all of that. And even within our country, you are right. Even within our country, we are still, I don't know, not quite able to overcome the racism in its entirety. Our leaders still haven't put the greater good before themselves. And I think that really is what I took away from all the reading and all the investigations that I did.
There are versions of Pan-Africanism that say the fault is those that have a different color. They should be made to pay for the sins of the past. What are your thoughts on reparation and all this thing that may look like racism in the reverse direction?
I do treat the subject matter of reparations in the book, not least of all because I heard it from community members, and but I actually came to the conclusion that I was not equipped to adequately deal with the question of reparations. Because I mean, to me, I had to ask myself, I mean, what is being paid for? Is it for the suffering and the pain,
Mm,
the anguish? What is the price of human suffering?
mm,
Those who died or those who lived? I mean, what are we paying for? If we are asking somebody to pay, and then you come and you come to modern day and you realize slavery hasn't ended, so it's still an ongoing crime.
mm,
So when a crime is ongoing and there are so many people involved in the crime, and so many people are injured, and so many people are you know still feeling like it's very much in the present, you know how are you going to start
mm,
to, I don't know, atone for something that's still ongoing? To me, the real question is, how are we going to put an end to slavery? That's really it. I i feel like
mm,
dwelling on that question of reparations has kept us back from looking to the future, which is Pan-Africanism, and saying, let's put our efforts into our future now.
mm,
I'm not saying forget what happened in the past. It has a lot of good and important um, things we can learn from. But I'm saying maybe all our energies placed into thinking of what is going to happen in the future for our children's children would be more valuable. Looking for leaders with a vision, looking to develop leaders with a vision is of more
mm.
importance than looking back and saying reparations, because that is like it's, I don't know, it's like a bog. You put your foot in and
Yeah.
it'll just drag you down. I don't see
Thank you
that
so
it
much
is
for that. So, and
moving us
this is
forward.
bringing it back to the personal level, our actions, or how we go from where we are. What do you think about the slave mentality in the mind of a typical black person among Africans, whether we are here at home or in the diaspora? What do you think about that? Is it something that needs to be addressed? Have we overcome it? Are we overcoming it? What do we need to do, ma'am?
Um, Overcoming it is really difficult. Um, and it's difficult because racism still exists. Um, I'm not too sure that it is something that will happen in our lifetimes, and
Mm,
for me that's very sad. I do feel, however, that if we focus on getting our history told properly from our perspective, we stand a chance of developing young minds that will start to think in the right direction. And I say this because I had to analyze, or I had to look closely at the mindsets of our ancestors. Don't forget, in the same generation, the same man that was picked up from Oyo came back, and undoubtedly, we have stories of them meeting the men who sold them into slavery, the men who captured them and placed them into slavery. And from a Lagos Island perspective, or community perspective, there was definitely a decision made at some point to let bygones be bygones
mhm,
so that a future could be built.
mm,
And I thought that was a very important message that my ancestors left, and an inheritance that Lagosians picked up. Um, they picked up on the ability to tolerate others. This they had to do for many communities that eventually became one. And the way it became one was through greater levels of tolerance. I say it in my book that it's not because we believe what you believe. It's not because we agree with you. It's not because we are coming from the same place as you, but it is because we are all flawed.
mm,
Understanding that each and every single one of us will have a fault somewhere in our past, and knowing that the important thing is the future. I think that's the way to overcome this. And I think that message comes out in the history when it is told in its entirety from the perspective of everybody who was involved. And that is not just the European side, but also the African story.
Mm.
From the European perspective, I wondered in the book how my ancestors even became Christians in the first place. Because
Mm-hmm.
why not throw the baby out with the bathwater? Here are the people who came and picked you up and put you into this misery, and then you adopt their religion. And they didn't adopt it wholeheartedly, I must admit that much. But the parts that they chose to focus on were very instructive into how us as a people can reclaim our identity, reclaim our self value, and develop values that will enable what you speak of, which is Pan Africanism and a future for us
Mm.
that is free from those, things that held us back, those incidences of war and slavery. Um, the great takeaway is that our history is important and it must be told, and it must be told by us. So, whilst I'm saying don't dwell on the history, I am saying it is extremely important to know the history in order to be able to move forward. Um, in terms of the discussion on where Nigeria should be right now, I think based on what I have seen or read and experienced over the course of writing the book, has helped me have a better appreciation of what the future could possibly be like. I call it in my book their superpower, but the superpower of those who were emancipated and came back to Africa was teamwork. That was their superpower. Even in Brazil, the reason they held the entire markets in Brazil to ransom because of teamwork. They
Mm.
came back to Africa with nothing, with no roots, without being able to connect to family or friends, and they still formed a community that was strong and they built a nation by teamwork. And so I agree with Andy on that point. We must find a way to work together and focus on our common um, on the things that are common to all of us. And there are things that are common to all of us, and things that we want. And
Mm-hmm.
if we focus on those things, the future will definitely be brighter.
Do share the video and keep following us on Iwinete Africa. We'll come back to you next time with more amazing.